I'm Joe Barrett, 48, and I built my life from a Navy daughter watching rank at the dinner table into a 2-star Rear Admiral commanding Carrier Strike Group 3. For years, I stayed quiet while my family overlooked what I had sacrificed, earned, and become. But when my own brother mocked me in uniform at the officers' club, in front of junior officers who had no idea who I really was, I made one choice that changed everything. I stopped explaining myself. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or humiliated by people you gave your loyalty to? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, dignity, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up knowing what a 4-stripe captain looked like in service dress blues before I knew how to read an analog clock. My father explained rank to me the way other fathers explained baseball. The rules mattered. The order mattered. The uniform told you exactly where you stood, and the people around you adjusted accordingly. I absorbed this before I was old enough to decide whether I wanted to, and by the time I was old enough to decide, it was already part of the structure I was building my life around. It was a weeknight in autumn of 1984. Robert Barrett, Lieutenant Commander, 04, Surface Warfare Officer, 12 years into a 30-year career, was home for dinner. This was not always the case in our household, and my mother Patricia managed that reality with the same quiet discipline she applied to most things. The table was set formally regardless. If my father was home, the chair held him. If he wasn't, the chair held the fact of his absence. And the fact of his absence held him just as well. I was 6 years old, and I understood this distinction the way children understand things that have never been explained, completely and without words, through the repeated evidence of how the household arranged itself around one person's presence and one person's lack of it. When my father was at the table, he talked about his ship. Not in technical terms, but in the language of a man who had given himself entirely to an institution. Duty, readiness, what it means to carry responsibility for other people's safety as a daily condition of your life. He talked about it the way some men talk about faith. Not to explain it, but to inhabit it, to make it real in the room, to let the people around him understand that this thing mattered, and he mattered inside it. I absorbed all of it. I had already asked him 3 times to explain the difference between a lieutenant and a lieutenant commander. He had explained it with patience each time, from the beginning each time, which was how I knew the distinction mattered. The things that mattered in our household got explained without impatience. My mother watched this from her end of the table. She didn't discourage it. She also didn't encourage it. She had married a man who belonged to the Navy first and had made a particular kind of peace with that arrangement, and I think she was not certain she wanted the same peace for her daughter. Not out of fear, but out of the specific knowledge of what that peace costs over time. I didn't understand that distinction at 6 years old. I understand it now, though by the time I understood it, there wasn't much to be done about it, except to carry the knowledge honestly. 5 years later, in 1989, my father took me to his command at Naval Station Norfolk. He was a commander now, 05, with a guided missile destroyer under his authority and the full bearing of a senior officer who has found the shape of his career and inhabits it without effort. He arranged a formal visit, sanctioned, organized, the kind of thing you did deliberately, not casually, and walked me through the spaces of the ship with his hand on my shoulder, narrating in the even, factual voice he used when something deserved to be taken seriously. I listened with the specific attention of a child who understood she was seeing something real and consequential, something that operated by rules with actual weight to them. At some point, I stopped at a chief petty officer and asked what his job was. He told me. I asked a follow-up question. The chief glanced at my father, who was hiding a smile behind his coffee cup and not quite managing it. Driving home that evening along the Norfolk waterfront, my father said I had a good instinct for asking the right questions. I was 11 years old, and I thought that was simply what fathers said to their daughters. It took me years to understand that it was the thing he said to officers he thought were worth developing, the specific observation he offered when he recognized an aptitude worth acknowledging. He meant both things at once, the daughter and the officer in formation, and for a long time that was enough for me. It was more than I knew what to do with at 11. He told me I asked the right questions. I was 11. What I did not understand then was that it would be the closest thing to direct mentorship he ever gave me. I spent the next 2 decades looking for that quality in his voice and finding it less and less often, until eventually I stopped looking and started building something that would have to speak for itself, whether or not he was listening. In 1995, the Naval Academy appointment letter arrived on a Thursday. I opened it at the kitchen table with my mother standing behind me. My father came in from the garage, and I handed it to him without saying anything. He read it, he set it down. He said, "The Naval Academy is exactly where a Barrett should be. Don't embarrass us." He was proud, I could see it clearly, and it was genuine, but his pride was institutional. The pride of an organization recognizing one of its own, not the pride of a father who was specifically, individually grateful his daughter was going somewhere meaningful. My mother hugged me afterward, for a long time, without saying a word. I registered the difference between those two responses and filed it somewhere I wouldn't examine for years. The following summer, I shipped to Annapolis for plebe summer. 3 weeks in, the most physically and psychologically compressed weeks of my young life, the kind that reorganize whatever understanding of yourself you arrived with, a call came to the duty phone. I was summoned from formation. My father's voice on the other end was unlike any I had heard from him before. Slower, with a lighter quality I would spend years trying to name accurately. He said, "You have a brother, born this morning, March 5th. I said congratulations and meant it. I asked if my mother was resting. He said yes. He said, "Good luck, Joe. Keep your head down." He hung up. I stood at the duty phone for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went back to formation. His name was Michael. I was 200 miles away in the 3rd week of the hardest thing I had ever done when he came into the world. My father's voice on that phone sounded lighter than I had ever heard it, as though something had lifted in him that had been sitting there for a long time. I was glad for my brother before I ever met him. I just didn't know yet what his arrival was going to cost me in the arithmetic of my father's attention, or how long it would take that cost to become visible to everyone involved. In May of 1999, I graduated from the Naval Academy and was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy. Robert and Patricia were there. Michael, 3 years old in a white polo shirt, impatient with the formality of it all, was there on my mother's hip. The photograph was taken, my father's hand on my shoulder, me in dress whites with my new ensign stripe, both of us looking at the camera. He was proud and it was real and it mattered. Then Michael began to fuss and my father's attention moved there naturally, and the moment was over, the way moments end when something louder comes along. I accepted my degree, my commission, and my first salute from a petty officer who came to attention and held it. I gave him $1, the traditional coin, and I did not look back toward my father. The photograph from my commissioning day lives in a box in my apartment in San Diego. My father's hand is on my shoulder. His eyes are already drifting somewhere past the camera. I've never hung it up. It's a good photograph, I just never needed to see it from across a room. I needed other things, and I went and built them, and that is the story from here. After September of 2001, the Navy reorganized what it needed and where it needed it. I was in the right place at the right time with the right aptitude, and my career stopped being a story I could tell at Christmas dinners. I told myself that was fine, that was the job, and the job didn't require an audience. What I did not account for, at 23, was how quickly a sustained silence becomes a story other people tell for you. And once someone else has been telling your story for long enough, correcting them starts to feel like an accusation against them, and so you let it go, and the silence compounds into something that takes on its own weight and its own permanence. I had been on a standard junior officer track, surface ship, lieutenant junior grade, 02, when the post-9/11 expansion of classified operational roles created a direction I followed without fully understanding where it led. By late 2001, I had been read into programs I couldn't name over dinner. I had a clearance level that required a separate conversation to even acknowledge. I called home less often. When I did call, my father asked what I was doing and I said staff work, mostly. It was the most accurate lie I would ever tell, and it was the lie that built every misunderstanding that followed. I was a lieutenant by 2003, doing work I couldn't explain in any restaurant or living room without either lying or violating agreements I had signed, and the gap between what my record said and what my family understood was widening every year, with nobody on either side making a move to close it. I told myself I was protecting operational security. That was partly true. The other part, the part I didn't examine honestly until much later, was that explaining myself to people who weren't paying attention had started to feel like a tax I was tired of paying with no return on the investment. The Navy, during those years, was changing rapidly. The post-9/11 environment created new categories of operational need that older officers had not trained for, and that younger officers with the right aptitude were pulled toward in ways that had no precedent in the normal career pipeline. I was one of those officers. The work suited me, challenged me, and built a career I believed in completely. The cost was that it made my record unreadable to anyone without the clearances to decode it. My father, a retired surface warfare captain, had no such clearances. My brother, a child, and then a student, and then a junior officer in a different community, had no reason to seek them. I understood this. What I failed to account for was that understanding a situation is not the same as being at peace with it. Christmas of 2007. I came home in service khakis. I was in transit, no time to change. I was a lieutenant, 03, 6 years into a career I couldn't summarize over a holiday meal. Michael was 11, tall for his age, sharp and restless. My father was 2 years into retirement and had settled into the rhythms of a man who spent 30 years being indispensable and was now channeling his considerable attention toward a new project. That project was Michael. My father talked about Michael's math scores, his discipline at school, his focus, the way he was already carrying himself. He said, "He's got exactly what it takes. I can see it already." He said it with the full weight of his investment behind it. The way he used to talk about his ship, not as prediction, but as recognition. Michael, at some point during the evening, asked me what I did. I said staff work, coordination, that sort of thing. He nodded and went back to whatever was happening on the other side of the table. Nobody asked a follow-up. I drank my coffee and watched my brother receive the particular quality of my father's attention that I remembered from when I was 11, and I calculated the distance between then and now with the precision of someone who had been doing that calculation for a long time. Michael was 11 that Christmas. He asked what I did, and I told him staff work. He accepted that the way children accept anything that doesn't immediately interest them, completely and without reservation, and forever. That was 2007. He was still accepting it in 2025. In 2014, Michael received his Naval Academy appointment, and my father organized a dinner. Extended family, neighbors, retired Navy colleagues, the kind of gathering Robert Barrett assembled effortlessly and completely when the occasion involved his son. I flew in from my current duty station. I was a lieutenant commander with 15 years of service and an unclassified biography that listed awards I couldn't explain and assignments I couldn't describe, and a clearance level that would have made most people in that room uncomfortable to know the details of. None of that came up. The evening was for Michael. My father's toast ran 12 minutes and mentioned Michael by name 9 times. He mentioned me once in passing, in a sentence about the family's Navy tradition. I gave Michael a card before I left. Study hard, sleep when you can, find one professor you actually trust. He pocketed it without reading it in front of me. I drove to the airport at 10 in the evening. I had been a lieutenant commander for 5 years by then. I had run operations I still couldn't describe in any public setting. My father gave a 12-minute toast and found his way to my name exactly once. I'm not telling you this to generate sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand that this wasn't a painful moment set apart from ordinary life. This was the climate of my family, unreflective and accepted by everyone in the room, including me, who had spent 19 years constructing the conditions for it through my sustained silence. 4 years later, in 2018, Michael graduated from the Naval Academy and was commissioned as an ensign. I was a commander, 05. The celebration was enormous. I stood in line for a photograph with my brother in his new uniform, and by the time I reached him, the photographer had been redirected. I ended up in one photograph, slightly off-center, partially cropped by Michael's shoulder. Nobody noticed because the evening was not organized around noticing me. I overheard Michael tell a friend, "Yeah, my sister's in the Navy too. She does logistics, I think. Staff work somewhere." He said it without lowering his voice. No cruelty, no intent to harm. He was simply reporting the information he had, the information I had spent 19 years providing through my sustained silence. That was the moment I understood the problem most clearly. There was nothing malicious in it. There was nothing at all. The filling of a silence with reasonable assumptions is not a betrayal. It is just what happens. In 2022, I called my father to tell him I had been selected for flag rank. Rear Admiral lower half, 07, 1 star. Fewer than 1% of commissioned officers ever get there. I said, "Dad, I've been promoted to Rear Admiral." There was a pause. He said, "That's a lot of responsibility. Let's hope you can handle it." Then, in the same breath, he told me Michael had just made Lieutenant, 03, one step above what I had been at 25. He delivered both announcements with equivalent weight. I said that was good news for Michael. I said goodbye. I sat on my couch for a while after the call and let the silence do what it needed to do. I told my father I had been selected for flag rank. He said, "That's a lot of responsibility," and then told me Michael had made lieutenant. He said it as though we were announcing comparable things. I had been doing the math on this family for a long time. That call was the first time I stopped trying to make the numbers feel fair. On a Friday evening in March of 2025, I stopped by the Officers Club at Naval Base San Diego in dress whites, intending to collect one drink before flying to Washington the next morning. I had a readiness brief that had run 45 minutes long and a travel folder already assembled on my desk. I wanted one drink in a quiet room before I packed and slept. That's all it was. I've told people this and they think I'm being modest. I am not being modest. One drink. That was the entire plan, start to finish. The strike group readiness brief ended late. My aide handed me the travel packet when it concluded. Flight information, Pentagon meeting schedule. The brief I would be expected to present Saturday morning. I signed off on 3 action items, changed into dress whites, and declined the car. I would drive myself. 4 rows of ribbons, 2 silver stars on the collar, 1 drink, and then the evening was mine to organize. The bar at the Officers Club on a Friday evening draws people from across the base. Officers winding down from the week, staff from neighboring commands, the casual cross-section of a naval installation on a late afternoon in early spring. I spotted the senior chief bartender I knew by sight and angled toward him across the floor. I was 10 feet from the bar when a voice cut across every other conversation in the room, loud and loose, and aimed with the casual authority of someone who had had 3 drinks and an audience already arranged around him. My brother Michael was at the far end of the bar with 3 junior officers from Rear Admiral Hayward's staff, 2 lieutenant junior grades, and an ensign, all of them significantly below the woman crossing the floor toward the bar. Michael was mid-story when he saw me. He pivoted. He said it clearly enough that heads turned in multiple directions. "Cute uniform. You rent it?" His group laughed. Someone at a nearby table looked over and then looked away. I did not stop walking. I did not look at him. I caught the senior chief's eye and nodded toward the bar. I turned to leave. I was not going to do this in a bar on a Friday in front of junior officers. I was not going to do it at all if I had anything to say about it. I had been choosing not to do it for 26 years, and one drink at the O Club was not going to change that. I didn't see Rear Admiral Hayward come in. I found out later he had been 2 steps behind me the entire time. Walked in through the foyer just as Michael opened his mouth. The timing was not fate or arranged symmetry or anything except a Friday in March. But it was the kind of Friday where the Navy reminded everyone in the room how large it was and how small a bar could get inside it. Rear Admiral Daniel Hayward had come from his own Friday brief and was cutting through to the dining room, a route that took him in through the foyer directly behind me. He heard the laughter. He looked toward the bar. His eyes moved across the group at the end, junior officers, a lieutenant he recognized from his own staff, mid-laugh, and then his gaze found the woman in dress whites walking ahead of him. 2 silver stars on the collar. Rear Admiral Barrett, his superior in the operational chain, the flag officer he briefed personally on a recurring basis, at meetings Michael had never been in the room for, on matters Michael had no clearance to know. 25 years of naval service means your face is managed even when your understanding of the situation is reorganizing itself entirely. Hayward went pale in a controlled way. He did not look at Michael yet. He looked at the silver stars, and then he walked forward, past me, to the end of the bar. Michael was still in the trailing edge of his laugh when he registered his commanding officer standing directly in front of him. The laugh died. The 3 junior officers with him had already gone rigid. They had seen Hayward's face and understood that something was happening even before they fully understood what. Michael looked at Hayward. Hayward looked at Michael with the leveled attention of a flag officer who has already processed the situation, arrived at a conclusion, and is now simply in the business of delivering it. The bar went quiet. Hayward said 4 words. "Pack your bags, son." He said them without raising his voice. In the even tone of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to announce it dramatically when stating it plainly accomplishes the same work more efficiently. Michael's face moved through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion first, then recognition spreading outward from behind his eyes, then something that looked like the ground giving way under him. Hayward gestured toward the door. Michael got up. They went. I accepted my drink from the senior chief. I sat at the bar. I did not watch them leave. I did not look satisfied or vindicated, or anything that could be read as performance from across the room. I was very still in the particular way of a person who has been waiting a long time for a room to understand something and has just watched it happen without her needing to say a single word. The senior chief slid a glass of water next to my drink without being asked. He said nothing. I appreciated that more than I could have explained. Through the foyer window, barely visible from my seat, Hayward and Michael in the parking lot. Hayward speaking quietly and steadily. Michael's posture deflating incrementally with each sentence. Not a collapse, just the slow, visible process of a man understanding in real time exactly what he had done and exactly what it meant for his career. I learned the content of that conversation through channels afterward. Hayward told him he had just publicly mocked the commander of Carrier Strike Group 3, his admiral's 2-star superior, in front of 8 other service members. That it was among the more professionally catastrophic things a lieutenant could do in a bar on a Friday. That he would be off Hayward's staff and on a transfer flight before sunrise. I sat at that bar for exactly 1 drink. I didn't look toward the parking lot again. 26 years of keeping my own counsel had just said everything I had never said, and it had done it without my participation. That is a specific kind of quiet that you don't forget. The silence after something has finally been understood is not the same as the silence you have been living in. It is lighter. It takes up less space in the room and less space in you. I set my empty glass down, thanked the senior chief, and walked out. The bar did not go quiet when I left. It was already quiet. I walked to my car alone in the San Diego night, and the silence around me was mine for the first time in a very long time. I want to say something about that silence, because it mattered in a way I had not anticipated. For 26 years, the silence I'd been living in was a silence I had constructed, carefully, deliberately, out of a decision not to argue, not to correct, not to place my record in front of people who weren't asking to see it. That silence had its own weight, its own ongoing maintenance cost. What I sat with in my car on the way home that night was different. It was the silence after something that had been wrong for a long time had been made right. Not by me, not through any action of mine, but by the simple and ordinary operation of a system I had served for 26 years, doing what it was built to do. A senior officer had witnessed a junior officer behave badly and had acted accordingly. That was the entire mechanism, and it turned out that the entire mechanism was enough. I was 30,000 feet over Arizona before I let myself actually think about it. Not what Michael said. I had heard worse from strangers who didn't know me and had no reason to care. What I thought about was the silence after, the specific quality of a room going quiet around something that did not require me to speak. 26 years of keeping my own counsel, and it turned out the accounting was going to happen on its own schedule, regardless of anything I did or didn't do. I was at the departure lounge by 06:30 the morning of March 8th, 2025. My phone showed 3 missed calls from a San Diego number I didn't have saved. Michael, calling from a personal cell at some point after I'd left the bar. I did not return them. I went through security, found coffee, boarded the flight, and let the work waiting for me in Washington fill the available space. Over Arizona, somewhere between the hum of the aircraft and the gray-yellow of the desert below, I allowed myself to sit with what had happened. Not to process it strategically, or decide what it meant for family relationships going forward. Just to look at it directly and let it be what it was. Then I put it away, because I had a Pentagon brief in less than 24 hours, and the work did not pause for evenings at the officers' club. 3 weeks later, still in Washington for a secondary logistics brief, Captain Sandra Voss flew in from San Diego. She was my chief of staff, 06, 24 years of service, the person on my staff whose judgment I trusted without qualification. We found a coffee shop near the Pentagon after her brief was done, a quiet table in the back, and I told her what had happened. Not as a complaint or a bid for sympathy. I stated it the way I would state any fact that is simply true and needs to be accounted for. Sandra listened without interrupting or redirecting, which is one of the things about her that has always made her straightforward to trust. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing words with care. Then, "Ma'am, with respect, you've been explaining yourself to that family since before you made 04. I'm not sure that stops unless you decide to let it stop. She wasn't wrong. I had been managing my family's understanding of me since 2001, not arguing, not correcting, not placing information in front of them and asking them to update their picture accordingly, managing quietly as though the silence were a kindness I was doing for them, as though protecting them from the full scope of what I did constituted some form of consideration rather than a slow withdrawal from the relationship." Sandra said it out loud in a coffee shop in Washington, and I spent the entire flight back to San Diego, deciding whether she was right. She was right. She had been right for a while, and I had known it and declined to act on it. My father called while I was still in Washington. Early April, evening, his voice careful and calibrated in the way of a man managing a situation he doesn't fully have the facts for and knows it. He said Michael was struggling. He said Hayward's response had been disproportionate, that surely a word from me could ease things. I let him finish without interrupting. Then I asked him one question, in the tone of a woman who genuinely wanted to know the answer. "Dad, has anyone in this family in 26 years ever actually looked up what I do?" He went quiet. Not thinking quiet, arriving quiet, the kind that comes when something lands and you don't have an immediate route around it. Then, "That's not fair," I said. "I know. Good night, Dad." I hung up. I did not feel triumphant about it. I felt tired in the specific way of a person who has been waiting a long time for one question to land, has finally delivered it, and now has to figure out what comes next. I returned to San Diego in mid-April and reviewed Michael's transfer paperwork. Hayward had moved him to a surface warfare posting in Norfolk, lateral in rank, significant in terms of career trajectory. A real assignment on a real ship with real responsibilities. Everyone in the Naval Service understands the difference between a flag officer's staff at Coronado and a departmental posting in Norfolk, arranged in 48 hours. But it was not punishment in any official sense. It was a consequence, which is a different thing and the correct thing. Michael was a lieutenant. He had time to recover from this if he was willing to do the work. I did not intervene in either direction. I went back to my strike group's readiness schedule. I reviewed Michael's transfer paperwork. Hayward had him on orders to Norfolk within 48 hours. A real posting, a real ship, a real opportunity. I didn't touch it. This was not my intervention to make. Hayward had acted on his authority as a commanding officer, assessing his own officer's conduct. The only thing my involvement could have done was make what happened smaller than it deserved to be. I want to be careful here, because what I am describing is not indifference to my brother. I was not indifferent to Michael. I had thought about him more in the weeks since March than I had in the previous 5 years combined, and not all of those thoughts were comfortable ones. I thought about the 11-year-old who asked me what I did at a Christmas table, and accepted the answer without a second question. I thought about the 22-year-old standing in a Navy commissioning uniform, telling his classmates I was in logistics. I thought about what it would take to be that person. A capable, well-trained, intelligent naval officer, and to have a sister who had been outranking your commanding officer for a year without your knowledge. I thought about what that discovery feels like at 29, in the parking lot of an officers' club at night, listening to a one-star walk you through exactly what you'd done. I had no appetite for adding to that. What I had was the belief, the professional considered belief, that Michael Barrett was someone who could learn from a consequence if the consequence was proportionate and the learning was left to him. Hayward had given him a consequence. I was leaving the learning to him. That was the correct disposition, and I held it. In late April, I called my mother, not to report or to process the situation out loud, just to call her. because it had been a few weeks and I wanted to hear her voice without an agenda attached. Patricia answered with the tone of a woman who had been waiting and was trying not to telegraph it. We talked about small things for a while, her garden, a neighbor's situation, the usual texture of her life in Virginia Beach. Then she said quietly, "I've been worried about both of you. Not Michael. Both." My mother had been doing that arithmetic for years, the kind that accounts for everyone in the room, not just the one making the most noise. I told her I would be at her birthday in September. She said she knew. We left it there because that was the right place to leave it. Both of you. Not Michael, not Joe, both. She had always been doing that math, quietly from the end of the table, seeing what everyone else was too busy to notice. I hung up the phone and sat with that for a long moment in the evening quiet of my apartment, thinking about the long consistency of my mother's attention and what it meant to have been held in it steadily for 47 years. My mother has never demanded that any of us understand each other. She has simply maintained a steady, patient clarity about what was happening in her family, and she has waited for the rest of us to catch up. For 47 years, she had been watching Robert pour his attention toward his career and then toward his son, watching me absorb the imbalance without complaint, watching Michael inherit a set of assumptions about his sister that were never interrogated because no one asked the necessary questions. She had not corrected any of us directly. She had simply stayed present, aware, and patient, the way the best officers I have served alongside stay present in a situation that is developing in a direction they can see but cannot yet act on. She had been waiting for the situation to develop. In March of 2025, it finally had. People assumed I had pulled strings to punish him. I want to be precise about this, because it matters, and because it is easy to construct the wrong story from what happened. I had done nothing. Hayward acted on his own assessment of his own officer's conduct in a public setting, which is exactly what a commanding officer is obligated to do. My role in the situation was to stay out of it entirely. That was not a passive or resigned posture. It was a deliberate recognition that the institution had functioned correctly, and the only thing my involvement could have accomplished was to interfere with a process that was doing exactly what it was built to do. In late April, I was contacted through informal family channels, a retired Navy friend of my father's, who played golf with one of Hayward's former staffers, who had apparently been tasked with the delicate work of exploring whether a word from me might ease Michael's transition. I declined in 2 lines of email, not unkind, but without space for a second attempt. I offered no explanation. I went back to my morning brief. Silence again. But a different kind from the silence I had maintained for 2 decades. Not the silence of someone who has given up arguing because arguing feels futile. The silence of someone who trusts the structure to hold without her hands on it constantly. That is a meaningful distinction, and it was the first time in my career that I could feel it clearly. There is something worth saying about what it feels like to stop. Not to win, not to be vindicated, not to have the confrontation you had been avoiding for years, just to stop. To stop carrying the weight of being misunderstood by people you love. I had been carrying it for so long that I had built my posture around it, the way a person builds their posture around a weight they've been holding so long they've forgotten they're holding it. The night at the Officers Club had not changed anything I had done or earned or built. My record was what it was, my rank was what it was, my command was what it was. What changed was that the silence I had been maintaining, the careful, sustained, managed silence of a woman who had decided that arguing was beneath her, had been broken by someone who walked through the right door at the right moment. And in the aftermath, I could feel the absence of the weight I had been carrying. Not relief exactly, something quieter than that. The particular stillness of a thing that has been set down after a long time in motion. Michael texted in early May. "Can we talk?" I waited 3 days before responding, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted the conversation to be mine to control when it happened. I wanted to come to it with clarity rather than with whatever residual energy the week since the bar had left in the room. I called him on a Tuesday morning. He was braced for something. I could hear it in how he answered. Ready for a confrontation, a lecture, the bar incident rehashed in daylight and assigned its formal meaning. What he got instead was a single question. What exactly did he think I did? He stumbled through an answer. Staff work somewhere, logistics management, some kind of coordination role, probably a lieutenant commander by now, maybe 05. He trailed off partway through the sentence. He could hear, as the words came out, that he was wrong. He just didn't know by how much. I told him. Carrier Strike Group 3, 30 ships, 200 aircraft, nearly 15,000 sailors, 2 silver stars, his commanding officer's superior in the operational chain, the flag officer Hayward briefed personally, on a recurring basis, at meetings Michael had never been in the room for. A long silence on his end of the call. I didn't know you were... I thought you were still in some kind of staff position. Dad always said. I know what Dad said. I requested a video call with my father not long after. I was calm when it began, not performing calm, just calm, because I had thought carefully about what I wanted to accomplish, and had decided that information, not emotion, was the correct instrument. I told him what Carrier Strike Group 3 was, the composition, the scope, the operational weight of commanding it. How long I had been a flag officer. What my rank meant in the hierarchy he spent 30 years inside. I did not use it as a weapon. I used it as information I was placing on the table because it belonged there and had been absent for too long. He listened. When I finished, the silence on his end stretched longer than a pause. Then, "Why didn't you ever say?" I asked. "Would it have mattered?" He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. What I needed was for him to sit inside the question without immediately finding his way around it, to feel the full weight of it, without the quick exit of a ready answer. He did that. My father is not a stupid man. He had spent 30 years pointing his considerable attention somewhere specific. And in that silence, I think he was accounting, for the first time in a real way, for the full cost of where he had been pointing it. In mid-May, a public affairs officer brought me a routine request. A Navy publication wanted a quote for a feature on Carrier Strike Group 3. I reviewed my unclassified official biography, publicly available on the Navy's website since 2022. 2 stars, command history, awards listed in unclassified language. It had been sitting there, accessible to anyone with a name and a search bar, for 3 years. My father had not looked. My brother had not looked. The information was never classified or hidden or difficult to find. It was simply unread. My official biography has been on the Navy website since 2022. Anyone who wanted to know could have found it in minutes. I want to be clear that I'm not bitter about this. There were times when I thought I should be bitter, when I sat across from my father's pride in his son's lieutenant's bars and thought about the flag rank I was carrying into the same room, unacknowledged. Bitterness is available to anyone who knows where to look for it. I decided a long time ago not to look. The work was better than bitterness. The work was always better. But sitting in my office in May of 2025, reading my own public record in the ordinary course of a workday, I understood something I hadn't fully put into words before. The problem was never secrecy. The problem was that no one had ever cared enough to look. And there is a particular loneliness in being findable and unfound for 26 years. A loneliness that doesn't get louder over time, just more settled, more structural, more part of the architecture of how you carry yourself. Late May, Patricia called me. She initiated this time, which I registered. She said my father had been on his computer in the evenings, that she had walked into the living room and the Navy website was open on the screen, that he hadn't closed it when she came in. He's been on the computer. He had the Navy website open, something about the strike group. He didn't close it when I came in. Good. She said my name. I said, Mom. Good. That's all. Good. My father at his desk in Virginia Beach, the screen showing the page he had been reading, his daughter's name in the caption below the photograph of the ship. He had been sitting there for a while. I don't know what he was thinking. I know he stayed. There is a specific moment in every major exercise when all the pieces come together at once. Every ship in position, every aircraft in the air, every radio net open and working simultaneously, the full machine of it operating at the level it was built for. I had been building toward that moment since I was an ensign 26 years before. I had never once tried to describe it at a Christmas dinner, never attempted to translate it into language that would make sense in my father's living room. Some things are not reducible to that, and I had learned early to stop trying and start being present for the thing itself. I was standing on the flag bridge of the Abraham Lincoln in June of 2025 with the Pacific wide and dark under the flight deck, and I was not thinking about the officers' club. By June, 3 things were happening at the same time. My strike group was in the middle of a full Pacific readiness exercise. Michael was several weeks into his Norfolk posting where no one knew or asked about his sister, and my father was reading Navy journals, doctrine publications, the Naval War College Review. He was reading the Navy the way a man reads something he has decided he needs to understand properly, from the beginning, without shortcuts. He was not ready to call. I was not waiting for him to. I had a strike group to run. The readiness exercise ran across multiple weeks and encompassed everything the strike group was certified to do. Aircraft cycling off the deck continuously, ships in formation across miles of open ocean, every net alive with the specific and purposeful traffic of a naval force operating at tempo. I was on the flag bridge for the peak periods, 20 hours at a stretch during the most intensive days, and my staff was excellent. The ships performed at certification level, and there was a moment somewhere in the middle of it all when every element came into position simultaneously. I noted it and moved immediately to the next call on the net. That is what operational command is. The moment arrives and you register it, and the next moment is already there waiting. I think about that moment often, not nostalgically, but as a reference point for everything else. The moment when everything is in position simultaneously is the purpose of everything that precedes it. The months of drilling, the exercises, the briefings, the personnel decisions, the logistics, the coordination with theater assets, all of it exists to produce that moment. When it arrives, you don't stop to feel it. You are already moving toward the next requirement. But in the brief second of registration before you move, there's something I would describe as confirmation. This is what the work was for. This is where all of it goes. I thought, in June, about my father reading the Naval War College Review in his living room in Virginia Beach. I thought about what it would mean to try to explain to him what I had just spent 3 weeks doing in the Pacific. Not the classified elements, the operational shape of it, the command weight of it, the experience of being responsible for the whole of it, continuously, for every hour of the exercise. I thought about whether he had the framework to receive that description and whether I wanted to try. Alas, I decided to wait. The reading he was doing would give him some of that framework. A phone call in November would give him more. The explanation would land better on ground that had been prepared for it. And I had learned, finally, that timing matters as much as content. In late July, my mother's most consistent report was that my father was reading in the evenings. The Naval War College Review, doctrine documents, fleet composition materials. He had looked up the organizational structure of a carrier strike group. He had read about command authority and operational chains. He had not called me. He was not ready. My mother said, "He doesn't know how to say it. He got 60 years into his life the other way. I don't know what to do with him when he's trying." I said, "Give him time and don't do it for him." She said she knew. In late June, Sandra called with a routine staff update and mentioned carefully, sideways, in the way of someone who has decided the Admiral should be aware that the Officers Club story had moved through the San Diego officer community. People were talking, not about the incident itself, which was already well understood. They were talking about me, about the 2 decades of sustained silence preceding it, about the patience of a 2-star admiral who had spent her career being described as a logistics officer by her own family. Frankly, ma'am, a fair number of people out here can't get past the fact that you've never said a word. Not in 26 years. I had things to do, Sandra. Through July, I followed Michael's situation through Patricia's weekly updates. He was keeping his head down in Norfolk, running his department cleanly, taking extra watches, not pushing to be noticed, not lobbying for visibility, not trying to rehabilitate his reputation through performance for an audience. His new commanding officer was a commander who didn't know the backstory and hadn't asked. Michael Barrett was, in that posting, simply a lieutenant doing the job he was assigned. I thought, that is where it starts, not with being seen, with doing the work until the work speaks for itself. My mother told me Michael was quiet at work, that he ran his department cleanly and didn't push to be noticed. I thought, that's not humility yet. That's someone who has understood, finally, that the room doesn't owe him an audience just because he showed up. That was more than I had expected from him in July. I'm not too proud to acknowledge that. Through late July, Patricia's most consistent update was that my father was reading in the evenings. She would find him in the living room with the Naval War College Review, or looking at doctrine documents or asking her questions she didn't have the background to answer. He had looked up the composition of a carrier strike group. He had read about command structure and operational authority. He had not called me. He was not ready. My mother said, "He doesn't know how to say it. He got 60 years into his life the other way. I don't know what to do with him when he's trying." I said, "Give him time and don't do it for him." She said she knew. In August, I received the formal presentation of a Distinguished Service Medal for service rendered during a classified operation in 2016, now sufficiently declassified for a public citation. The process of declassification had taken several years, the citation having been drafted and held pending a review that ran longer than anticipated. By the time the medal was formally presented, the operation it recognized was 9 years in the past. That is how classified careers work. The recognition arrives on the institution's schedule, not on your own timeline, and the gap between the action and the acknowledgement can span a decade or more. I had known the medal was coming for 2 years before it arrived. I had not mentioned it to my family. There was no mechanism through which I could have explained what it was for, and a medal without an explicable reason felt like more mystery rather than less. The ceremony was small. Sandra, a handful of senior staff, a vice admiral who flew in for the presentation. No family. They had not been invited, not because of the officers' club or any deliberate statement about the year we'd had, but because I had never developed the habit of inviting them to things they hadn't asked to be part of. The citation used government language, factual and restrained, exactly as much as the situation required. The citation was in government language, factual, restrained, exactly as much as it needed to say, and nothing beyond. Sandra took a photograph afterward, which I asked her to send to no one. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because that is what 26 years of work looks like when it isn't performed for an audience. It looks like a small room and a citation in government type and a vice admiral's handshake. And it was enough. It had always been enough. The question had only ever been whether I believed that independently of whether anyone else confirmed it. My mother turned 70 on September 8th, 2025, and asked for a dinner. Not a party, a dinner, at the house, with the people who belonged in it. I flew in from San Diego. Michael drove up from Norfolk. It was the first time we had been in the same room since the officers' club, 6 months before. Nothing was resolved at Patricia's birthday dinner. But something began, which is a genuinely different thing. And on the Barrett family's timeline, a beginning was already more than most people thought was possible. I arrived first. Patricia and I had an hour in the kitchen before anyone else came. She cooked. I set the table. We talked about small things, the garden she had expanded in the spring, a neighbor's situation she had been following, what she was reading, whether the coffee I was making was too strong. I made it the same strength I always did. She smiled and didn't argue. This hour was deliberate on her part. I understood that clearly. She was giving me a room without pressure, before the room filled with people who would bring their own weight to the evening. She had always known when to do that and when not to. I noticed and was grateful in the way I am grateful for most things Patricia does, quietly, without making a production of acknowledging it. My mother turned 70 and asked for a dinner. She asked me to come early. She understood without discussion that the evening needed an hour in a kitchen before it could be whatever it was going to be, and that the hour needed to be between her and me before anyone else arrived. She was right. She was usually right about things like that, and I had learned a long time ago to trust her instincts about what a room needed. My father arrived before Michael. He and I were in the same space for the first time since before the incident, since before March, since before everything that had followed March. He did not mention the officers' club. He asked about my flight, about the weather in San Diego, whether I had been sleeping enough during the deployment prep. Then, carefully, deliberately, with the slight hesitation of a man who has been practicing the specific words, "How is Carrier Strike Group 3 going?" He used the full name. I heard what that cost him and did not make a thing of it. I gave him a real answer. The readiness certification had come back clean. We were moving into fall deployment prep. The strike group was performing at a high level. He nodded. He asked a follow-up question. We moved into the kitchen together and let it rest there, which was exactly the right amount of progress for a birthday dinner in September. "How is Carrier Strike Group 3? How is it going?" "Good. Readiness certification came back clean. We're starting fall deployment prep next month." "Good." Michael arrived with flowers for Patricia and said hello to our father and hugged our mother, then looked at me across the kitchen and nodded. Not a smile yet. A nod. the careful, deliberate kind that communicates acknowledgement without pretending more warmth than the moment has yet built. I nodded back in the same register. There was a particular precision to that exchange. Two people agreeing, without words, on exactly how much warmth the moment had earned and no more. It was honest in a way that a hug would not have been. We were starting from where we actually were, not from where a birthday dinner suggested we should be. I respected that. I think he understood that I respected it, and that understanding made the rest of the evening easier. We sat down to dinner. Patricia steered the conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who has been managing that table for 45 years and knows precisely when to let a conversation run on its own and when to guide it. At some point, Michael asked me whether the strike group would deploy soon. I said yes, a Pacific exercise in the spring. He nodded. He said, "That's a big command." I looked at him. 2 words, plainly stated, no performance or scaffolding around them. "Yes," I said, "it is. That's a big command." "Yes, it is." After dinner, Patricia sent us both out to bring in the chairs from the back porch. A warm September evening, still light, the air carrying the particular quality of early fall in Virginia Beach. We carried the chairs in silence for a moment. Then Michael stopped. He started to say something, stopped himself, started again from a different place. He said, "I didn't know." I said I knew that. He said it wasn't an excuse. I agreed. It wasn't. I told him the information was always public, always available, findable by anyone who looked. He said he had never looked. I said I knew. I had always known that. That was the thing that was hard to say and that needed to be said. He said he was sorry. 2 words, nothing built around them to soften them or contextualize them, just the words. I didn't know, and I know it's not an excuse. No, it isn't, and I know you know that. I'm sorry. Yeah? We carried the chairs inside. Standing in that back porch doorway in the September evening, I thought about what it takes to say a thing like that, "I'm sorry," without scaffolding around it. Without the explanation that softens it, or the context that reframes it, or the additional information that makes it feel smaller than it is. Michael had done it with 2 words and nothing else. And I understood what that had cost him, and I said yeah because yeah was the honest response and anything more would have been something other than honest. That is the kind of exchange you cannot plan. You can only be ready for it when it arrives, and you can only receive it the way it was meant, plainly, without making it into something larger than 2 people carrying chairs in from a back porch on a warm September evening. It was enough. I want to be clear about that. It was genuinely enough. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, and not because the work of the relationship was done, it wasn't. But because in the architecture of the Barrett family, 2 words from my brother on a back porch in Virginia Beach, said plainly and received plainly, was a more significant event than anything that had happened at the officers' club. The club was about the institution doing its job. The porch was about us. I stayed one night at a nearby hotel and drove to the airport before 7 the next morning. I took the long way past the house. My mother was on the front step with her coffee, earlier than she usually was, early in a way that was clearly deliberate. I rolled down the window. She raised her mug like a toast, eyes bright, and stayed on the step watching me go. There is no ceremony for the kind of progress that happened at that table. It doesn't look like a resolution. It looks like chairs being carried in from the porch. It looks like a nod across a kitchen. It looks like my mother on the front step at 6 in the morning with her coffee raised for something she had been waiting a long time to see. I drove to the airport thinking, that's what the beginning of something looks like. Nothing more than that, but nothing less either. I drove to the airport in the early morning dark, and I thought about what it means to begin something. The story I'd been telling myself for years was about an ending, about the moment when my family would finally understand what I had built, when the silence would be broken and the accounting would be complete. What I understood on the drive to the airport was that the ending I had been imagining was actually a beginning, and that beginnings are more demanding than endings because they require you to stay present for what comes next. I was ready for that. I was more ready for it than I had been for anything in a long time. I turned 48 on October 15th, 2025. I worked in the morning because the work doesn't pause for birthdays, and I have never expected it to. My aide brought a card from the staff. Sandra sent a brief, warm message in the morning. My mother called at noon Virginia Beach time. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, which is to say, we talked about everything. Her garden, a book she was halfway through, what she was planning to make for Thanksgiving, whether I had been sleeping enough during the deployment prep. The kind of conversation that doesn't require an agenda and is better for not having one. My father called in the afternoon, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He said happy birthday, asked about the deployment prep, asked whether I was getting enough sleep. He did not mention the officers' club or the May call or the 40-minute call in November that hadn't happened yet. He didn't need to. The call itself, the 4 minutes and 12 seconds of it, unprompted, the week after Patricia's birthday dinner, was already something new in the architecture of our relationship. Not large, not resolved, but new. Michael texted, HBD, Joe. 3 words. The first time he had reached out on his own initiative since the porch conversation in September. I turned 48. My father called for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. My brother texted me 3 words. My mother talked to me for 20 minutes about her garden and a book and Thanksgiving plans. That was my birthday. It was the best one I'd had in a long time, and it was the best one precisely because nothing in it was performed. Nothing offered out of obligation, nothing managed from a careful distance. Just people who had decided to try. Through October and November, the strike group's fall deployment prep was underway. Rosters, exercises, logistics briefings, the accumulated machinery of moving a carrier strike group toward an operational deployment in January. My days were full in the purposeful way they had always been, except that something in the surrounding architecture had changed. Sandra mentioned it over coffee one morning. She said I seemed different, not lighter, not dramatically altered. Cleaner was the word she chose. Like something held in tension had been released and the remaining structure was better for it. Sandra said I seemed cleaner. I've been thinking about that word since she said it. For 26 years, I had been carrying a version of myself that existed to be explained to people who weren't paying attention. I was done explaining. What was left was just the work, and the work had always been enough. I had just spent too long looking over my shoulder to be sure. In November, my father called with an agenda. Not stated explicitly, but audible in the preamble. The careful approach of a man who is prepared for a conversation and wants to get it right. He had been reading the Naval War College Review. He asked a real question about how carrier strike group commanders coordinate with theater commands during a Pacific exercise. I answered. He asked a follow-up about the Admiral's battle rhythm in a deployed environment. I told him. The call ran 40 minutes, and at some point in the middle of it, he said he had been trying to understand the scope of what I did. I said I knew. He said my mother had asked him what he would say to me if he could say anything, and he had not had an answer, and that not having an answer had been bothering him. Your mother asked me what I would say to you if I could say anything. I didn't have an answer. I've been sitting with that. And I'm still sitting with it. That was enough. I didn't need the answer that evening. I needed him to be sitting inside the question without looking for the quickest exit, and he was doing that, and that was more than I had expected when I picked up the phone. I thought about that call for a while after we hung up. My father was 73 years old, and he was sitting with a question my mother had asked him, and he had admitted to me that he didn't have the answer yet, and he had done it without rancor or defense. That is not nothing. For a man who had organized his emotional life around certainty, around the clarity of rank and institution, and the confidence that came from knowing exactly where he stood in a hierarchy, sitting with an unanswered question about his own choices was genuinely difficult. I didn't need him to arrive at an answer quickly. I needed him to stay in the room with the question, and he was doing that. And I could hear it in the 40-minute call, and I was grateful for it in the quiet way I was learning to be grateful for things that arrived slowly, but arrived honestly. There is a specific kind of patience that a career like mine builds in you. Not patience with people. I have always been better at that than I give myself credit for. But patience with time. Naval service teaches you that most things do not happen when you want them to. They happen when the conditions are right, and the conditions are built over months and years of preparation that looks, at close range, like nothing is happening. My father sitting with a question he couldn't answer was preparation. My brother working quietly in Norfolk was preparation. The 40 minutes of a November phone call where a retired captain asked his daughter real questions about carrier operations was preparation. For what exactly, I didn't know yet. But I knew it was preparation. I had spent 26 years doing that kind of work. In December, I stood at a holiday function on the base in a room full of people I had built something with. My staff, my ship commanders, junior officers I had watched develop across the year. I wore the 2 silver stars without thinking about them, which is how you know something has become true rather than performed. I looked around the room. Something had resolved in me that I couldn't precisely name, but could feel clearly. I was not waiting for a verdict from outside this room. The verdict had always been in this room. I had just taken a long time to stop checking elsewhere. There was a holiday function at the base in December. I stood in a room full of people I had built something with, wearing a uniform I had earned 1 year at a time, and I thought, when did this become ordinary? And then, when did ordinary become enough? And then, it always was. I just kept looking up to see if someone from the right place was watching. Late December, after the workday ended, I walked along the waterfront. The Pacific was dark and wide. I thought about Michael and my father and what I actually wanted from them now. Not what I deserved or what they owed me, but what I wanted the next chapter of this family to look like. Now that the seeing had happened, now that the silence had finally spoken. I didn't know yet. But I was curious. That was genuinely new. For 26 years, I had been waiting for something to be understood. Now the understanding had arrived and the question had changed entirely. And I was curious about the answer for the first time in a long time. The water is the thing I come back to when I need to think clearly. And I have thought clearly more often standing at the edge of the Pacific than anywhere else in my adult life. There is something about the scale of it, the way it extends past any reasonable sightline and continues beyond that, that puts the small things in their correct proportion and the large things in context. Standing at that waterfront in December, I understood that the next chapter of the Barrett family was going to require patience from me, the same way a deployment required patience. Not passive waiting, but the active, purposeful maintenance of a course while the conditions developed. I could do that. I had been doing it in one form or another for 26 years. The difference was that now I was doing it for something I actually wanted, not just something I was managing to keep from getting worse. We left in January of 2026. I stood on the bridge wing of the Lincoln and watched San Diego go. The coastline pulls away differently when you know what you're going toward, when the deployment ahead represents the fullest expression of everything you have spent the better part of 3 decades building. The city shrank behind us. The Pacific expanded in every direction. I had been building toward this since I was an ensign with $1 to give a saluting petty officer at Annapolis, not the deployment specifically. This, the moment when the work fills the entire frame and there's nothing left to explain to anyone. Carrier Strike Group 3 deployed to the Western Pacific in January of 2026. A carrier. Cruisers and destroyers in formation across miles of open water. Submarines in coordinated positions. Aircraft cycling through sorties around the clock, day and night, the flight deck never fully quiet. Nearly 15,000 sailors under my command in the most complex operational environment the Navy works in regularly. My father used to explain naval rank to me at a dinner table in Virginia Beach, and now I was standing on the bridge wing of a nuclear aircraft carrier, commanding a force of scope and consequence that most people, including most naval officers, never get close to. I thought about that for a moment, the specific distance from that kitchen table to this bridge wing, and then I turned back to the work. The major exercise came in February, 48 hours at full operational tempo, every piece of the strike group working in coordinated complexity. My staff was excellent throughout. The ships performed at certification level or above it. There was a moment around hour 30 when everything came into alignment simultaneously. Every ship on station, every aircraft in position, every net open and working, the full machine of it operating exactly as designed. I noted it. I moved to the next call on the net. That is what the job is, and I have loved the job for exactly that reason, because the moment arrives and you register it, and the next moment is already there, demanding your full attention. There will be other moments. There are always other moments. That is the work. On March 5th, 2026, Michael turned 30. I left him a voicemail on his birthday. I had thought about what to say and decided, as I usually do when I think carefully about something, to say exactly what I meant without construction around it. Happy birthday. You're 30, 8 years in, and you haven't quit. That counts for something. I'll see you when I'm back. He called back 2 hours later. We talked for 22 minutes, most of it about work. He asked what it was like when I first made lieutenant commander, what changed, what people treated differently, what you understood about your own career that you hadn't understood at 03. I told him. He listened with the specific attention of someone who actually needs the information and knows it. He asked what I wished I had known at his stage. I thought about it and said that no one is keeping track for you. You have to keep your own account. A pause on his end. Then, yeah. He called back 2 hours later and we talked for 22 minutes, mostly about the job. He asked what changed when I made 04. I told him. He listened the way you listen, when you actually need the information, when the need is real and not performed. That was new. That was genuinely, concretely new. And I was glad for it, in a way I didn't try to make larger than it was. At the end of that call, before we said goodbye, there was a moment of silence that was comfortable, in a way no silence between us had been before March of 2025. Not managed silence, not the silence of two people deciding simultaneously not to say the thing they're thinking. Just silence. The ordinary kind that sits between two people who have talked long enough that the talking can pause without the pause meaning anything other than pause. I noticed it. I think he noticed it too. We said goodbye, and I went back to the work, and the Pacific was wide around the ship, and I thought, that is what it sounds like when something has started to be all right. In late March, the strike group was heading home. I called my mother from the ship, a Liberty call, not strictly necessary, but I wanted to make it because I wanted to. She answered on the second ring. I told her we were coming back in 2 weeks. She said she knew she had been watching the Navy news. I asked if she had been monitoring fleet movement specifically. She said, I learned from someone. I laughed. I told her I planned to stop in Virginia Beach on the way back. She said she knew that too. I asked whether Michael might want to come up from Norfolk for a visit. She said he had already asked 2 weeks before I had booked my flight. He asked 2 weeks ago if you were coming. I told him I didn't know yet. He said he'd come up anyway. Good. He asked before I did. I want to remember that. He called my mother 2 weeks out and asked whether his sister was coming home. I want to remember what it felt like to hear that. Not triumphant, not vindicated, not the satisfaction I had sometimes imagined feeling when I imagined this family finally reckoning with the gap between their picture and the reality. Just, good. That's all. That is the right word and the complete thought. Good. In April of 2026, Michael and I arrived within the hour of each other. Him driving up from Norfolk, me flying in from San Diego. My mother had been cooking. The house smelled like garlic and something slow and deliberate. My father was already at the table when I came through the front door. He stood up. He looked at me across the room. He said one word, Admiral. Not in irony and not as an acknowledgement of any specific moment in the year that had just passed. He said it the way a man says a fact he has decided, finally, to stop withholding. Clean and direct, without ceremony around it. Admiral! Dad! We sat down to dinner. Michael poured the wine. Patricia asked someone to get the bread from the kitchen counter. My father asked a real question about the Pacific exercise, and I answered it. Michael asked something about Norfolk, and I asked him something back. The conversation found its own level the way conversations do when the people in them have finally decided to show up to each other honestly and without reservation. He called me Admiral. I don't know whether he'll do that always. I don't need him to. That is not the point and has never been the point. What I needed was for him to say the right word in the right room without it being a performance or a concession extracted from him, and that was exactly what he did. I just said Dad and sat down, and the conversation was easy in the way that only hard-earned conversations ever manage to be easy. My mother sat with her wine glass raised, eyes bright, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The table was full, the room was warm, the Pacific 3,000 miles away was exactly where I had left it, waiting for whenever I came back. You spend a long time thinking that being seen is the thing that fixes it. It isn't the thing. What fixed it, not completely, never perfectly, but enough, was stopping. Stopping carrying a silence that was never mine to carry in the first place. Stopping shrinking into rooms where I was already the largest thing in them. I didn't win anything that Friday night at the Officers Club, but I stopped losing. And after 26 years of not losing quietly, that felt a lot like everything. If you're carrying something like that, something you've been waiting for someone else to notice, I want you to hear this. The noticing was never the point. The work was the point. The work was always the point. You already know that. You've always known that. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't proving yourself, it's realizing you never should have had to. If this story made you think about respect, family, silence, or the moment you finally stopped carrying what wasn't yours, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set a boundary after years of being overlooked? Have you ever chosen peace over explanation? I'd love to hear your story. And if you want more true stories about strength, self-worth, and standing tall when others underestimate you, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications.